President Trump is escalating his rhetoric ahead of the midterm elections. The president yesterday called for Republicans to take over elections while ranting about his 2020 loss to Joe Biden. He made the comments during an interview with right-wing podcaster and former FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino.
These people were brought to our country to vote, and they vote illegally. And amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting. And we have states that are so crooked, and they're counting votes. We have states that I won that show I didn't win. Now you're going to see something in Georgia where they were able to get, with a court order, the ballots. You're going to see some interesting things come out. But, like the 2020 election, I won that election by so much. Everybody does it.
We will note the president has no constitutional power on the issue of elections. Under the Constitution, the times, places, and manner of holding elections are determined by each state, not the federal government. Congress has only the power to set election rules. So, Joe, the president clearly making it clear that the midterms are of great interest to him.
Well, I mean, and the president, of course, lying repeatedly, as he's been lying repeatedly since 2020 about losing an election that he claims he won. And yet he told people close to him, I can't believe that guy beat me. He knew he lost the election. He knows he still lost the election. He knows that he lost Georgia by over 11,000 votes. That's why I asked Brad Raffensperger to steal 11,000 plus votes for him. He knows this. He knows this. In 2020, he tried to use it as an excuse to start a riot and seize power and throw out a presidential election. Now in 2026, he wants to start using this and start scheming so he can seize the elections in 2026, because he knows that right now, because of his policies, because of the policies of the Republican Party, the Democrats are in a position to absolutely rout Republicans. And when they do, he'll actually have to be held accountable for his policies, and he may have to actually even compromise with Democrats and do what other presidents do and try to get legislation passed. Try to do what Joe Biden was able to do and actually pass a lot of bipartisan legislation. But instead, he started lying and now talking about seizing records. No. It's Jonathan Lemire. It really is hard to keep count of all the crazy things that are coming out of the White House right now. Just the bizarre things that have been coming out of the White House over the past 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Whether you're talking about tearing down the West Wing or taking over the Kennedy Center and then having Rick Grenell and him run it into the ground so much that they have to shut it down for 2 years because they've so destroyed the financial base of that institution in just a few short months. We could talk about everything. Greenland. We could talk about seizing oil in Venezuela. We could talk about trying to destroy NATO alliances. We could talk about all the billions and billions of dollars his family's raking in right now. We could talk about all of that. But it seems to me, well, all of that is critical. This right here is what I think people who actually love democracy and love America like I love America. And I don't love America if Republicans are in power or if Democrats are in power. I just love America. I love it unconditionally. And can be critical of it and want it to be better and become a more perfect union. But this is one of those moments where the president's trying to do something clearly unconstitutional. Of course, we can't count on the Supreme Court to do anything, but I think maybe they play pickleball. Maybe they built an indoor pickleball court, and maybe that's why John Roberts wants everybody to sign NDAs in the Supreme Court, which is really bizarre. But I don't know what they're doing in the Supreme Court. But while the president's talking this way about doing unconstitutional things, it seems to me this is a really great place for everybody who loves America and loves American democracy and loves free elections to focus, because this actually is one of those 5-alarm fires.
Yeah, it's been a dizzying amount of stories and, frankly, nonsense, and some of it very dangerous, coming out of the Trump administration in recent months. The pace certainly accelerated in the fall, and that you didn't even mention like the ice surges in American cities across this country. But you're right. This is the big lie. This is what fueled the January 6th insurrection. The President of the United States tried to overturn the results of a free and fair election in 2020. He still will not acknowledge publicly that he lost. And there sure seems to be sense that he's laying the groundwork to interfere with 2026 and 2028. We just heard him in that interview. It's worth reading the quote again. He says, quote, "The Republicans should say, we want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting." 15 places, likely swing states, important districts that could determine the House or the Senate, or in the 2028, the presidential. As we're going to hear more about in a moment, the president even fielded a phone call from Tulsi Gabbard, who was part of that operation, the FBI operation at Fulton County, Georgia. Willie, this is extremely dangerous. And I'll say this show has been focused on it, and a lot of Democrats have too, that this is the storyline is what's going to happen with the midterms. Because Donald Trump knows if Democrats win, even one house, they're going to have the power of the subpoena. They're going to be able to run investigations into him and his family and his administration. They could theoretically impeach him again for a third time, which is something that really bothers him. He would be held accountable. And right now, there's real fear that he and his administration are going to find a way, many ways perhaps, to put their thumb on the scale. There'll be elections. The question is whether they be free and fair.
And it may be underway in the state of Georgia already. You heard President Trump say in that soundbite that things are going to be interesting, in his word, coming out of Georgia, as officials in Fulton County confirm they now will challenge in court the FBI's seizure of those 2020 election documents. The Fulton County commissioner said yesterday the county will argue the search warrant used to justify last week's raid of their election facility went beyond the scope of what federal law enforcement was legally allowed to do. The commissioner argues that while the FBI is authorized to copy records under a separate court order, agents instead took the original copies, including in-person, absentee, and provisional ballots. Last Wednesday, a team of FBI investigators swarmed the Fulton County election facility near Atlanta, officials taking 700 boxes of ballots and voter information related to the 2020 presidential election. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard was on site during the search, has been leading the White House's ongoing investigation into the 2020 race. President Trump continues to call falsely fraudulent. Meanwhile, we're learning more this morning about President Trump's actions directly after that FBI raid. The New York Times reports the day after the search of the Fulton County elections facility, Tulsi Gabbard facilitated a call between the president and the FBI team working on the investigation. That's according to 3 people with knowledge of that meeting. The Times writes this: the president addressed the agents on speakerphone, asking them questions as well as praising and thanking them for their work on the inquiry. In a letter to lawmakers who were pressing for more details, Gabbard denied that Trump asked questions or issued directives during the call. The paper also pointed to the unprecedented nature of the meeting. Rather than going to senior department or FBI officials, Trump spoke directly to the frontline agents doing the granular work of a politically sensitive investigation in which he has a large personal stake. A White House spokesperson defended the president's Georgia investigation on the whole, saying he has pledged to secure America's elections. Those 2020 elections were secure, of course, but the Justice Department, the FBI, have declined to comment. So, David Rohde, go to you first on this and just the unusual nature, to put it very mildly, first of the raid, of course, but also of Tulsi Gabbard being there and then facilitating this call, sort of a rah-rah, way to go, guys call that you might get from an extraction team or something like that in the military after a successful mission.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And I spoke to former national security officials. The Director of National Intelligence position was created after 9/11 in 2005. We've had it for roughly 20 years. No other director has ever done anything like this. To go down and participate in a law enforcement operation, it's very unusual. And so there's real surprise at that. And the claim is, and I spoke to her staff yesterday, that they are looking for foreign interference in the Georgia election. There is no credible evidence of foreign interference in the Georgia election. The president, after these records were seized, was posting late at night The theories that were talked about in 2020. One involves Italian satellites. Former Attorney General Bill Barr went and investigated that claim in Italy. You know, it's false. There was one other thing he posted about China somehow changing these votes. And just to me, the issue here is just you have more power being concentrated in the president. If Donald Trump succeeds and Republicans nationalize the election and the way what we've seen this administration work, Donald Trump will be deciding the outcome of elections in 15 states, an unprecedented concentration of power in an American president that's never before happened in our history.
David French, appropriate time to mention your latest piece for the New York Times. It's entitled, "This is Not a Drill." In it, you write in part, quote, "A president who doesn't care about the law, who commands an obedient Congress and is supported by a radicalized base of tens of millions of people who believe his lies, represents a threat to the next election. I fear that millions of citizens are still too complacent. They aren't aware of the peril we face. So consider this to be something like a fire drill. It's an alarm, one of thousands that should be ringing across the country. MAGA's acts of aggression are already intimidating. Trump isn't just trying to stop the steal again. Another kind of theft might be already underway." Joe, an alarm that you've been sounding, and many of the guests that come on our show who study situations like this have been carefully and methodically pointing how we are headed in the wrong direction and have passed many boundaries.
Well, he passes boundaries every day, especially on this. And of course, you have, and I'm so glad David didn't just talk about Donald Trump, but talked about millions of people who blindly follow him. It's like a cult. These are the people who, after January the 6th, were outraged and shocked because, they used to not like police officers getting the hell beaten out of them. And then Donald Trump told them it was okay to beat the hell out of cops. So then they forgave him for that. And of course, now you have Republicans celebrating the execution of a man in the streets of Minnesota, Chicago, our Illinois Republicans, glorifying the execution of another American in the street. And you realize that suddenly all of this election stuff is awfully esoteric, and they're not going to complain about it because they don't complain about anything because their minds are just completely owned by Donald Trump. And so I'm not talking about all people that voted for Donald Trump. We see the polls. There's some people who actually understand the dangers. But here, David French, again, this is built upon the stupid lie. And it's not even a smart, this is a stupid lie that the 2020 elections were stolen. 63 federal judges threw out 63 of Donald Trump's stupid claims that the 2020 election was stolen, including the Supreme Court, including Thomas and Alito. All of them threw it out, said it was stupid. You had Donald Trump's own administration and the person in charge of elections saying it was the safest, it was the fairest, cleanest election in the history of our constitutional republic. So these aren't even good lies. These aren't even doesn't even make us do any work. It's right in front of our faces. And now he's basically saying, you got Pam Bondi in Minnesota saying, yeah, we'll stop terrorizing your state if you turn over all your voting files. That's in Minnesota. And now in Georgia, Tulsi Gabbard is now in charge of seizing voters' files in Georgia. That is so unconstitutional. States run elections, not presidents who are scared their party's going to lose. And it's not an overstatement at all to say that this looks like what autocratic regimes do. This looks like what Orban does. This looks like what Putin does. This looks like what all the worst of the worst across the world do. And right now, it's happening again in Georgia.
Yeah, Joe, one of the things about this that's so frustrating is even after January 6th, even after everything we went through at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, I think there are still people who say, no, this is all bluster. This is all talk. This is what he does. Yeah, what he does is he directly describes what he's going to do about elections. What he does is he directly says what's on his mind about elections. And I don't know why people aren't believing him. I don't know why there isn't more of an outcry here, because it's being forecast, it's being broadcast to us, all of the intentions right in front of our faces. And so, one of the things that we have to do in response is not just do what we're doing now, amplify and talk about what the real alarm is, but also start to think of concrete things, concrete policies that can be enacted or at least proposed to bring awareness to this and hopefully roll back some of these efforts. But make no mistake, the intentions are very clear and right in front of our faces.
So Brendan Nyland tweeted out last night a couple of headlines. I want to read them to you because the people that say, oh, this is just Trump being Trump. From October 10th, 2020, Ross Douthat, there will be no Trump coup. He predicts in October 10th, 2020. The final pre-election case for understanding the president as a noisy weakling, not a budding autocrat. Ross, one of those who tries to use his intellectual powers at times to justify the absolute insanity of what's going on constitutionally in this republic. And then Mick Mulvaney, if he loses, Trump will concede gracefully. He'll fight hard to make sure the results are fair. And in the end, he'll accept whatever the results will be. So, David French, please, we've heard it before. We understand what we're up against. We have to make sure that our elections are free and fair. And all of these anti-Trumpers, all of these sane washers, they've already almost destroyed the republic once on January 6th, 2021, by trying to apologize for the president leading up to it.
Well, look, before January 6th, there was a massive failure of imagination. I think singling out a couple of pieces, I didn't see people predicting storming the Capitol. So there was a lot of failure of imagination that was widespread across the political class before January 6th. That is something that had not happened before. Now it's happened. It has happened. And so when that phrase Trump being Trump, which used to mean, oh, all bluster, no action, I think it means something else now. If someone says, oh, that's just being Trump being Trump, I say, yeah, absolutely. It is Trump being Trump, and Trump being Trump as he tries to steal elections. And he talks about it right in front of our faces. There's nothing hidden about it. And so, yeah, that phrase, Trump being Trump, doesn't mean what it used to mean.